Welcome to part 4 of Great Depression and the New Deal. Now we're going to talk about the impact of the Great Depression. Now, I often ask my classes, what are your options when you can't afford to purchase the things that you need, right? And I want them to really think about that seriously. Put yourself in the position, you cannot purchase the things that you need. What do you do? Now, I'll tell you, typically, you can break this into 3 categories. Typically, students come up with a lot of options in one of the 3 categories, a few in the second, and almost none in the third, and there's really a reason for this. I'll give you some examples of some answers I get. Take out a loan. Go move back in with your parents, right? What else? Get a second job. Of course, typically you get some comical ones too. Die, okay. Prostitution, I put that under second job, right? Those ones, I almost always get those 2 for some reason. But, you know, most of the ones that I get fall under a category that I call increasing purchasing power, right? That one comes usually to students really quickly and really readily. Increasing purchasing power, here's some more examples of it, right? Try to get paid more, try and get a raise, right? Change jobs, unionize, send more members of the household out to work, right? Take on extra jobs, take out loans first with family, then with banks, okay? Increasing purchasing power, that's one thing you can do when you can't afford the things that you need. The second option, and this one you usually get a few students get a few ideas on this, stifle demand. Right? Stifle demand. Economize. You know, make your own stuff. Right? I can't afford canned tomatoes, so I'm growing tomatoes. I'm going to can them myself. I'm going to make my own dresses. As a matter of fact, during the Depression, you're going to see the flour companies. Flour used to come in fabric sacks. They began printing patterns on the fabric sacks because women would use the flour sacks to make dresses for their daughters and things like that. You know, stretch your money further, trade, barter. So those 2 are often what students focus in on. And during the Great Depression, stifle demand and increasing purchasing power is going to be the main 2 goals. Because the third thing you can do is something that during the Great Depression isn't really to any great effect. And that is control prices. Make things cheaper. Right? How do you do that? Well, usually you have to do it collectively. Protest, riot, strike, right? Lobby, things like that. These are collective actions. But the reason why during the Great Depression this doesn't really have a great effect, or this isn't really an option, is because prices were going down. Everything, you know, because everything was so saturated. You know, we talked about the cost of bushels of wheat, for example. By 1932, a bushel of wheat is 49 cents a bushel, right? The prices plummeted, so there's really no reason to protest the price of things or try and get the prices lowered because, well, they already were there. You saw that during World War I when you had a 60% inflation rate. That's when you saw things like a bread riot in the United States, a meat boycott, but you're not going to see that here. So the economy has crashed. Unemployment has skyrocketed. For example, unemployment had gone from 3.2% to 24.9% by 1933, right? Over pretty much a quarter of all Americans are out of work, right? 12 million people, 12 million of the workforce, right? Industrial production has dropped by 50%. Capital investment has dropped by 98% in the United States, right? People have stopped getting married. They've stopped having children. They have stopped going to college. They can't afford to do these things. Divorce rates drop, not because there's not any marital strife, but because you can't afford to get a divorce, right? You blame this on someone, right? Well, in this case, we blame it on Herbert Hoover. And from that, we end up with a whole list of Hooverisms, terms applied to Hoover that illustrate the strife and turmoil of the day. For example, your blanket that you're using as you're sleeping on a park bench, a newspaper, right, is a Hoover blanket, right? You have your car's broken down. You're having it towed by horses instead because it doesn't operate anymore. Well, that's a Hoover wagon, right? Your pockets turned out, there's no money in them, so it's just turned out pockets. Well, that's a Hoover flag. Okay. You're playing poker, you get 4 cards to a flush, but you just don't get that 5th card. That's a busted flush or a Hoover flush. Maybe some of you guys can still use that term today. You're catching wild rabbits for food, Hoover hogs. Right? You got shoes, you can't afford to get them resold, so there's holes in them. Well, those are Hoover shoes. Right? If you eat by mixing ketchup with hot water, actually in college we called that condiment soup. That's when you were too broke for ramen, which, believe it or not, you can be. Well, that was Hoover soup, ketchup and water. And then, of course, the most prominent Hooverism that was used during this time was the makeshift shanty towns that were set up, which were called Hoovervilles, makeshift little shelters. People are going to try and divert their attention from the strife they're under, right? People are going to go to movies in large numbers, right? Even despite the fact that, times are tough, you might be able to find some way to scrape up the nickel to go to the Nickelodeon, hence where the name comes from, right, to watch something. People are doing all kinds of different things, right? You got, of course, Prohibition is still on, so you still have the speakeasies in operation. My personal favorite diversion and pastime was the dance marathon, like the picture you see here. Right? These were insane. People would sign up and you dance, and you had to dance. The way it worked is you danced for 45 minutes and then you were given a 15-minute break. There you could get something to eat or sleep or whatever, and the last person standing wins the competition. Right? When you're on the dance floor, you had to just keep moving. Now, during prime time, you were required to be a little bit more active, like, a little bit more, well, maybe not the jitterbug, but, a little bit more active in your dance. But during the down times, you could be like you see in these pictures here, right? As long as you kept moving, you were still in. And so people would take turns. On this 45 minutes, you sleep on me, I'll drag you around. And on the next one, I get to sleep and you drag and you drag me around. You go back and forth on this. Like you see this poor woman on the left here, she's clearly done, and I think so is he. But the beautiful thing about these is people paid to watch this stuff, which is amazing. You got fed every break, right? So you could be fed, typically it'd be about 12 times a day. You get a little snack, right? And if you won it, you got a cash prize that could be as high as, typically a few $100, which was still pretty significant, but it could be, the highest one I know of is around $5,000. Now, the longest of these took place in 1930 in Chicago. A dance-off there went 2,780 hours. That's 115 days. All right, so it's amazing what people do to distract themselves. Americans' perception on crime is going to change during this time period as well. For example, Al Capone is actually going to be seen as a local hero there in Chicago. He's making $100 million a year in Prohibition, so he's opening up soup kitchens. He's feeding the poor there in Chicago. Bank robbers are almost seen as glamorous because they're, well, I don't know if you want to call them Robin Hoods, but they're certainly taking it to the man, if you will, right? Robbing the banks, who a lot of people blame for the financial strife they're in. So people like John Dillinger, or Bonnie and Clyde, or Pretty Boy Floyd, like you see here, are seen as heroes. These people are doing something. But, to be fair, the government is doing something too.